if I could vote for you for president, I would feel a lot more assured. Or another candidate who would pick you as an economic advisor, I would be like, this would be a very optimistic conversation.
Sure.
That not being the case, being the case that President Biden is the president of the States of America, and he recently said in a speech when asked, "Do you think you're the best president to meet the desires of the progressive part of your party?" responded saying, "Well, of course I'm the best. I'm the only option they have. I'm the president of the United States of America."
Yeah.
Your views on abortion have evolved in your public life. Are you the best messenger to carry this forward when Democrats, many of them, many progressives, want you to do more?
Yeah, I am. I'm the president of the United States of America. That makes me the best messenger.
That being the case, so I'm like listening to you talk and I'm listening to you make all of the sense. But the gap between what you're saying and what feels at all politically viable absent an actual left insurrection is making me, is like setting my teeth on edge. We live in a world, like I sit at Rising now 3 days a week, and I have these conversations with my libertarian co-host. And when the problems with the system come up that you've just described, all of the corruption, et cetera, his commentary is obviously, well, this is why we shouldn't have government. It never works. It shouldn't work. You were better off with the free market, which I don't have to explain to anybody listening to this why that's not my take. However, there is something that feels insurmountable to it. And I think on some level, you do have to address the concerns of a lot of Americans who are perhaps less ideological compared to my co-host, but who are still skeptical that, you know, with all of the problems that are in the government, with all of the corruption that happens, with all of the ways that government can be co-opted, why would you want to confer it more power? Even your point about not wanting to nationalize until you can figure that problem out.
Yeah, and that's why most of my effort personally is not to kind of push existing power structures into doing policy X or policy Y or policy Z. Most of my effort as an educator is in educating the public, empowering people with an alternative narrative and mobilizing people, because that's how you democratize the system. When your constituents can call your bluff and provide an alternative narrative. And one of the things that we have to learn from the right is how Reagan in the US and Thatcher in the UK really changed the world in the 1970s for the worst, in my view. They didn't shift the public discourse from sort of a welfare state type of model to a neoliberal model by winning academic debates in professional academic journals. As a matter of fact, their Economist lost all those debates in the 1960s. But here's how they changed the world. They had a compelling narrative. They were brilliant communicators. They went to the public and said, "We feel your pain, and we know how to deal with it, and we know who's to blame." Similarly, Trump did the same, by the way, in 2016 when he came to the deindustrialized Midwest, and Bernie did the same, by the way. Mm-hmm. They both pinched a nerve in this part of the country. They said, number one, we feel your pain. We know that the establishment Democrats and Republicans lied to you, threw you under the bus, neglected you, took away your jobs. And of course, Trump had his narrative. And he said, well, I'm going to build a wall. I'm going to go after XYZ. And and of course, fired up a lot of people on the right. And Bernie, of course, had his narrative in terms of how do we deal with that, the Green New Deal and job creation and higher wages and healthcare. All of those issues, that nerve that they pinched in 2015, 2016 is still raw here. And this is how you change the system, by mobilizing people with a coherent narrative, not just on the political front, on the emotional front, but you have to have a coherent narrative on the economic front. And once you have those masses and you have your coherent policy strategy, you can change the system. But for an individual to change the system from the top without the underlying support, it's not going to work.
That's what's so frustrating, is that there isn't a Democratic Party that is willing to even make these arguments. Even if You can't get Congress behind them. Even if Biden couldn't pass anything, let's just pretend he was completely powerless and it was all rhetorical. We don't even have a Democratic Party who is willing to make the case for why more spending in this moment is necessary. They got their COVID spending package, did their little thing, and then immediately started acting ashamed of it, even when it was popular.
Yeah.
Even when they didn't double down and cheer on their successes. Democrats are seemingly embarrassed of the fact that they're Democrats.
We didn't. The problem is that we had enough grassroots supports from the grassroots, but not enough to overwhelm the Democratic Party and actually vote people out of office. And that is still the challenge. We had enough of a big push with the Bernie movement, but it wasn't enough to overwhelm the system. And that's why they resort to keeping the status quo. And you have to acknowledge that in Congress, people in Congress, representatives, lots of the names that you don't hear about at the national level. I call them sort of followers. And they're really the interesting group right now because they're looking to the right and to the left of the party. They're saying they're seeing the Bernie and AOC and kind of the squad movement setting people on fire, so to speak, in terms of mobilizing grassroots of the party. And they're looking at the right of the party and saying the power, the money, the influence, the Nancy Pelosi control of the system. And they're trying to decide, which way do I go? Do I stick with the establishment because it's still powerful? Or do I look forward to the future and see this new wave of progressive energy that's going to overtake the party? And we're not at that tipping point yet, where you see troves of those representatives giving up the establishment and joining the popular progressive movement.
And why would they, when mainstream Democrats are giving so much cover to the status quo approach to the economy? There's so much vulnerability, in doing so. So I wanna get to just one more topic, but first I gotta close the loop on. I just want to ask you, like, quick and dirty. Would you support price controls? And wait a minute, before we even get there, Nixon talks about price and wage controls. And the wage control part sits more uneasily with me just as a progressive than the price control part. But as I've read, these things, go together. Can you explain that and why I shouldn't have hesitation around the idea of wage controls?
Well, because it's anti-labor.
So I should have hesitation around wage controls.
Yeah, absolutely. And the focus of the Nixon, most of the pressure of the Nixon administration was on the wage level, not so much on the price level.
Right.
And that's really
I've heard people say that that's why it went wrong. Exactly. But is it necessary to have some wage controls if you're going to do price controls?
No, not necessarily. Not necessarily. If anything, in our situation today, wages have not been able to keep up with inflation, with the cost of living. So why would you want to control wages at this point in time when people can barely afford rent, can barely afford? If anything, we need one way to deal with the existing inflation that's coming out of Russia and the Ukraine and the global disruption is not by squeezing workers into poverty and into unemployment, is actually by supporting workers so they can cover the cost of living during this crisis. Instead, we're throwing workers under the bus. We're throwing the middle class, the working class under the bus in the name of controlling inflation. That's the price control that we have right now.
Let me ask you this, though. Is it the case that if people got higher salaries, that it would put more stress on the demand and the supply crisis? Are you going to see an inflationary effect unless you do some of the other, antitrust or addressing price gouging or actually creating more supply because you're ending the war or things like that?
That's why you have to do all the above.
I see.
But squeezing wages and workers, throwing them under the bus as the only solution to inflation is the problem. Mm-hmm. And people who say we don't like price controls, by the way, we do have price controls. Right now, it's by corporations, right? It's the abusive market. That is a form of price control. The price control that the Fed uses is by throwing millions of people into unemployment to fight inflation. That's the price control system they use. And we're saying that's not the best way for a democratic society, the most effective way for the richest country in the world to throw millions of people into poverty and unemployment and neglect in the name of protecting the status quo of corporate power and abuse and protecting the established power structures within corporate America and at the global level as well.
So what's the trick then for unwinding it? Let's say hypothetically, Joe Biden had a change of heart, implemented price controls, actually supported a living wage, et cetera, and we go into a period of stability. When it's over, let's say 2 years from now, what is the trick for not having some of the negative effects that happened in the 1970s at the end of Nixon's price controls?
Well, one of the things that will happen on the corporate side as soon as you put price controls is that corporations will actually slow down production. Because it becomes not profitable enough for them to build more infrastructure and produce more stuff.
Nationalize.
So they will create, well,
Let's
exactly.
nationalize.
They will create the shortages. And once you have shortages, you build up a long, and a very strong pent up demand. And as soon as you remove the restrictions, the supply side is not going to keep up with the new demand. So these are the problems that you create when you introduce price controls in a very narrow way without actually having a clear understanding of what creates the pressure in
But
the
help me
price
understand
system.
this, because it seems to me that if you're a manufacturer who decides to slow down production because it's no longer so profitable for you, fine. Is there no communication between government and manufacturers to say, okay, we're about to lift these. We anticipate demand being this. You want to profit. You've been clamoring to profit more. Shouldn't the invisible hand of the market dictate that those manufacturers are primed and ready to increase manufacturing for that moment so that there aren't those kind of lags?
So we did have that during World War II. We created an administration called the OPA, the Office of Price Administration. And it did have corporate employees in the private sector who were managers of the production system and managers of the price system who, because of the patriotic mood of World War II, even though they were employed in the private sector, they were patriotic to the federal government's demand for price controls. And they did not attempt to slow down production artificially in order to hurt the national effort. So that was pretty successful at that time. The only place during that World War II price control and rationing system where we had sort of a hiccup was in the meat production industry because it wasn't as controlled and centralized, and it wasn't. It didn't because it touched really people's daily lives when you ration how much meat you can eat, and especially in rural areas, and that was politically not successful and economically not successful, and created a lot of pent up demand in that sector when we released the price controls. But on the manufacturing side, we had a pretty successful effort because we had individuals within the corporate sectors who were more loyal to the national effort than to shareholders and owners of capital. And that was unique to that moment. I don't know how we can recreate that or if we can recreate that, but that's part of the success of the World War II effort was due to a national commitment to dealing with the national priority, which is winning World War II and dealing with the shortages of inputs, because most of the inputs were dedicated to producing tanks and airplanes and military equipment rather than consumer goods. And we had across the board effort to control demand, because when we paid workers decent wages to build military equipment for the war effort, we paid them decent wages, but they didn't have the consumer goods to buy. So they could have, gone out on a shopping spree and caused massive inflation. But instead, we had the US Treasury offer them an opportunity to postpone their consumption and be paid for it. And that's what we call war bonds or freedom bonds. So you take your income, you buy US Treasuries. In other words, you put your money in a savings account that pays you back after the war plus interest. So again, we leverage the patriotic mood of the nation to postpone consumption. Some people call it forced savings, but it was really voluntary. People didn't have an option. There were no new homes to buy. There were no new cars to buy. And the Treasury was offering you a great opportunity, guaranteed to save your money and be paid an interest. And of course, it was marketed as this is your way of contributing to the war effort. So when you deal with inflation pressure points and shortages, you have to deal with them across the board, like we did during World War II. The good news is that we don't have to go to the extreme sort of measures that we had to do during World War II, like rationing of key things and slowing down the speed limit to save rubber because we had a rubber shortage during. We don't have to go that far. Much more tame intervention, but the regulatory infrastructure that we have today is much weaker and much more controlled and dictated by corporate interest than what we had even in the 1970s, but especially compared to what we had in World War II. So that's the failure of the system, is when we've lost the regulatory influence of the federal government, thanks to 4 decades of neoliberal influence and control and deregulation. That's where the strategic weakness is. And now this is a wake-up call for us to recognize that there's a role for the government to play. And it's not just by jumping and controlling prices, but first starting with its own regulatory infrastructure and introducing regulatory systems that will force the corporate sector to be more competitive, to not price gouge and not dominate and abuse the system.
So is there anything, again, I'm sorry to have electoral brain, but is there anything that Biden can do or should do in the shorter term before midterms?
Oh, you're talking about midterms.
Yeah.
I think that's I'm not going to be the optimistic voice in this conversation today. To be realistic, I mean, what Biden has done and can do, it doesn't seem like he's willing to really ruffle the feathers, so to speak.
Yeah.
When it comes to, introducing some regulations and some strategic intervention to deal with inflation, he has gone for the kind of the lowest hanging fruit with the minimum disruption to the system. That is to say, putting money on the table to increase the logistical capabilities of ports to unclog the supply chains. Well, that's helpful, but you didn't go after the abusive market power of price setters in the system. You didn't regulate. You didn't intervene on regulating labor standards for truck drivers, for example. So because that's more disruptive. In the last month or so, the federal government is finally going after global shipping companies. We have 9 shipping companies that took advantage of the pandemic and raised the cost of shipping from, say, $2,000 a piece for a container coming from China to up to $20,000, $30,000 a piece. Jesus. For no good reason. It's not because of energy prices or labor shortages. Those are excuses. So he's going after kind of the weakest links in the system who can't push back. But is he going to go after the big dogs, so to speak, in the system? I don't think so. I don't think he has the political courage or capital or will to do that. And he said it during the election cycle leading up to his presidency. And it's been his attitude as a senator for the last, 30, 40 years. So why would it be any different in the next few months leading up to November? So we have to be realistic. Even FDR, if you want to really concentrate the power of change in the hands of the president, FDR is well known for saying, to grassroots movements and the progressive voices, I agree with you. Now make me do it.
Yeah. Well, but that's what I'm trying to get at, though. If we were to want to make him do something, I don't even know what to ask him to do. And so what I'm asking is not what you think pragmatically he's going to do, but what you would do in that situation, what the demand should be.
Well, one of the first things you want to do on the economic front is start with understanding the price system so that you know where you kind of direct your anger and your force and your regulation. So start with this small army of economists and statisticians that we have in Washington, D.C., which is CBO, the Congressional Budget Office. And, most people know the CBO for telling Congress, this is how much the deficit will increase if you spend this much. Well, that's really not useful information. That small army of economists, you can ask them to detect the actual inflation pressure points. Which are the industries? Look at the inflation statistics, the consumer price index, and identify where the inflation pressure points are coming from a micro perspective. detect the abusive market power that we have in the system, and provide Congress, provide the president with that information so we know exactly where to go.
Okay.
And once you identify that, you realize that to deal with the inflation pressure point in a particular industry, you have to increase productive capacity. If the private sector is not willing to do it, then at that point, you go and either nationalize or add kind of publicly owned and publicly directed investments, strategic investments, like we did during World War II. Did we ask the market during World War II to produce military equipment for us? No, we didn't. We took over the city of Detroit and we shut down manufacturing of cars and we produced military equipment because that was the national priority, right? What are our national priorities today? Is our national priority to protect the corporate interest and the price gougers? If that's what it is, then of course we should wait for inflation to disappear somehow after a few years. But if we want to go after the source of inflation, we have to understand where it's coming from and then be able to call their bluff and push for an alternative narrative. And once you kind of expose this to the public, you'll have the forces, the grassroots forces on the right and on the left that will support a presidential decree, so to speak, and federal government action to go after it. But calling them price gougers in the vague without having evidence other than, a corporate phone call where CEOs are saying, well, the pricing environment is favorable, so our profits are higher this quarter. Well, that's a starting point, but it doesn't get us into the weeds and through the details of how the system works.
Hey, YouTube, thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.